Charles was glad about the Cerberus' offer of the horses. He knew that two-horned horses were born already at level 3, and that they developed into level 4 creatures as they matured. Although they were generally calm, they were able to make use of their horns to stab their enemies when threatened. Nevertheless, they were considered relatively weak as far as level 4 creatures went. This was due partly to the fact that they were quick to bow to authority without putting much of a fight, which was judged a particularly weak trait in Hell. Because of this trait, these horses were easy to tame with Charles's Divine Might technique. Charles could feel the ability's menacing aura pulsing through his veins. It gave him a strange desire for violence. The two-horned horses in front of him quivered with fear, partly because of the deadly look in his eye, but also because they had seen how heartless he had been in the massacre of the giant corpse hounds. Rather than retreat or prepare to defend themselves, they lowered their heads to him. He wasn't surprised to have dominated them so quickly. They were such a low-level creature that if they hadn't learned to bow to more powerful beings, they would have been exterminated long ago. The horses' greatest use was that they proved reliable and effective steeds. They were famous for their high levels of endurance and their great speed, which made them a valuable asset to any cavalry. Also, although their attacks were weak and fairly simple, their horns meant that they were easily able to defend themselves, so their rider wouldn't need to worry about being cut off in battle. Charles understood that the main reason that forces throughout history had failed to establish knighthoods was that they hadn't been able to source good mounts. If a mount proved weak and not worth the grass it took to raise it, there would be no qualms in killing it and using its meat for rations. In those situations, the cost of keeping it alive simply couldn't be justified. Elena and Miranda were frightened by the dangerous aura they could sense coming from Charles. They too were still a little scared of how ruthlessly he had led the battle with the Hellhounds. How many creatures has he killed? Miranda wondered. And does it ever bother him? Hugh and the others also felt their hearts tremble in front of the almost unhinged look in Charles's eyes. They had come to understand why he never seemed to worry about the loyalty of his followers. In the face of his total ruthlessness, who would ever dare to betray him? Ever since he had reached level 4, his power had seemed to become limitless. It felt to them that the stronger the enemy he was up against, the greater his own strength would grow to match it. "Two-horned horses," he called. "Bow to me." He took out a long spear that flickered in the hellfire. This was his silver spear, covered in cryptic runes and suffused with an inexplicable power. "I invoke the contract between species, the true power of my predecessor," he shouted. When the Cerberuses heard these words, tears came to their eyes. Although they had already confirmed Charles's identity as their master's successor when he had first demonstrated his ability to strengthen the master's seal on their curse, they were still impressed by his knowledge and use of the contract. They knew that their master's power was boundless, but were still surprised to see how much of it had passed to Charles. The fact that he had mastered such a complicated power proved that he really did have a chance of inheriting the full power of their master. "I will use this spear to seal the contract," he announced to the two-horned horses. "With a drop of your blood, you will become my servants and fight for me and my warriors." Without a hint of resistance, the two-horned horses lined up to offer their blood as proof of their loyalty. Such blood pacts were common, not only in Hell, but throughout the entire underworld. In fact, it was exactly this sort of pact that made up the foundation of all summoning magic, whereas summoning paranormal would force creatures to make such a contract, forcing them to do their bidding when called upon in battle. This was exactly how Anthony's powers worked. Charles was glad to see how obediently the two-horned horses followed his word. They clearly understood the importance of such contracts. Once they had all given a drop of blood, he turned to the Cerberus pack. "I'll leave this silver spear here," he said. "Keep it safe for me. I also ask you to help me find more two-horned horses." Although two-horned horses were hardy steeds, and the great number that had just signed the pact would hardly be dying anytime soon, Charles felt that they could never have enough of them. He could use them not only as steeds, but also as cannon fodder. Also, as the contract had been sealed using the silver spear, its continuity was bound to the existence of the spear. Charles needed it to be protected from harm, and he could think of no better guardians than the Cerberus pack. He had in mind a special method for his warriors to use the contract to summon the two-horned horses to use as mounts. This would involve developing a certain level of cooperation between the two species, which he didn't think would be too difficult. "We will do what you ask," said one of the Cerberuses. "You should also know that our master left the Book of Contract here. When your powers grow, perhaps you'll have a use for it. It'll let you summon all the creatures in this territory as your servants." Charles was surprised. He had heard of the Book of Contract. His silver spear fulfilled the same objective, although on a more limited scale. His powers weren't yet sufficient to use the book, but as the Cerberus' inheritor, there was no reason Charles wouldn't be able to make use of it in time. However, the Cerberuses could see that Charles didn't have the strength to do so at that moment, so they didn't give it to him just yet. After the two-horned horses had submitted, Charles turned to the Nightmare Horses, a species which reached the peak of level 5 by adulthood. They were vicious and cruel, and were known to eat the hearts of their enemies. They were also fast as lightning and able to walk on water. Charles knew that they wouldn't offer their loyalty as easily as the two-horned horses, because they wouldn't accept the same pact as in the contract between species. They would only agree to aid someone if they stood as equals. There was only one way that Charles knew that one could prove oneself equal to a Nightmare Horse: by defeating it in battle. "The Nightmare Horses won't submit so easily," growled one of the Cerberuses, spotting that Charles was preparing to try and make some agreement with them. "If you only want them for mounts, that's one thing. But if you want them to aid your knighthood with the same contract you signed with the two-headed horses, it'll be much more difficult." It wasn't that the Nightmare Horses wouldn't submit at all, but that they would only do so to one they judged to be strong enough. Getting them to agree to any kind of contract would be a real challenge. But Charles surveyed the 80-odd Nightmare Horses before him, and though he couldn't help doubting himself, he decided that it was a challenge worth attempting. 3 of the Nightmare Horses, clearly stronger than the others, trotted forward from their herd. "Human," said one with a red horn on its forehead, "if you wish to win our loyalty, display your strength. We yield to the Cerberus pack because they are strong. Why should we yield to you?" It spoke in English, as only level 6 beings could understand the language of hell. Its words were clear enough to Charles. In essence, it was saying that while their herd had surrendered to the Cerberus pack, they wouldn't surrender quite so easily to him. If he wanted to make use of them, he would have to fight them first. He looked around. "I only see 80 of you," he said. "Is your herd really so small?" "Of course not," said the Cerberus. "These are only the representatives of the Nightmare Horses. They have to be careful in these parts. The giant Corpse Hound pack often hunts their kind. There are many others of different levels throughout hell." So the Nightmare Horses have both strong and weak members, thought Charles, just like us humans. If the Nightmare Horses were allowed to live and breed as normal, the giant Corpse Hound pack wouldn't be able to suppress them at all. Therefore, the hounds would regularly hunt the horses to keep their population down. Charles nodded. "I see," he said. "So, you speak for the rest of your species?" "Listen," snapped the red-horned horse. "If you think we're just going to roll over and submit like the two-horned horses, think again. We'd rather die than become servants. As I said, we'll only help you if you can show you're stronger than us." Charles understood. Even the Knights of Hell, led by such a great warrior as he, could only enter into a contract of equals with the Nightmare Horses. The Cerberuses were lying not far away, watching the exchange with amused interest, as though they had front row seats at an entertaining show. They weren't worried about Charles's safety. Since Charles was clearly their master's successor, they knew he could fend for himself. "I'm willing to sign a contract of equals," Charles said. "By these rules, the summoner can call upon the Nightmare Horses if they can show they are able to defeat you in a fight. In exchange for this power, we will be held responsible for the safety of your species." The contract had many clauses and conditions. If the Nightmare Horses were exterminated, the Knights of Hell would be too. The contract would allow them to fight side by side, with the Knights using the Nightmare Horses as steeds. They wouldn't be allowed to cause harm to the horses or in any way betray them. However, if Charles or his Knights came across an enemy too strong to be resisted, they would be able to offer a Nightmare Horse as a sacrifice to cover their retreat. Despite this, they couldn't use one as bait to deliberately lure the enemy. If this entire clan of Nightmare Horses was destroyed, each knight who had signed the contract would suffer a soul injury, which would vary in degree. A light injury would lower their cultivation level, while a more serious one would cause them to become extremely ill. It would make their strength deteriorate indefinitely without the possibility of ever healing. Finally, the most serious injuries would cause them to lose their minds and die on the spot. It was clear then that this was a different kind of contract to the one they had made with the two-horned horses. It made sure that taking the initiative in battle wouldn't be the duty of the nightmare horses, but their human summoners. "You don't seem to have understood me," said the red-horned horse, eyeing Charles with an unfriendly gaze. "We will only submit to those who defeat us in battle. Put away your conditions. Even in an equal contract, you are not qualified to sign it until you can prove yourself." As it spoke, Charles could feel its aura expand, bringing a heavy pressure down on everyone. It made the Knights of Hell feel as if they were suffocating. Elena reached for her sword. Just as she was about to draw it, though, she was stopped by Miranda. "Don't worry," she muttered. "Trust him." Despite her words, her eyes were filled with worry. She felt powerless, but believed wholeheartedly that Charles wouldn't have got himself in such a dangerous situation if he wasn't sure he could get out of it in one piece. At that moment, though, she couldn't see how he was going to manage to do so. If this is the end for Charles, she thought with a heavy heart, can I really take his place? Tommy looked at the nightmare horses and gulped. "There's over 80 of them," he said to Charles. "All of them are at least level 5, and these 3 leaders are at level 6. I hope you know what you're doing." It was clear that the Cerberus Pack didn't intend to interfere in the matter. As far as they were concerned, it was a matter between Charles and the nightmare horses. The Cerberus Pack had provided the arena of engagement, but it wasn't their place to offer further assistance or comment. By that point, the pressure inflicted by the horses was nearly unbearable. Back in the mortal world, a single level 5 being was considered an almighty force, easily able to establish a survival base single-handedly. Even in Dawn City, there weren't many experts of this level. In Hell, though, over 80 beings of this level were unleashing their powers at the same time, creating an incredible pressure that made it difficult for the knights to even move their fingers, let alone draw their blades. They couldn't believe that Charles was really trying to make this powerful force submit to him. It seemed impossible. It had been one thing to achieve the Cerberus' approval of the meeting, but it was clear that the nightmare horses wouldn't yield their position. Paralyzed and almost crushed by the immense pressure, they were surprised to hear Charles say in an almost flippant tone, "Do you really think you can reject me?" The Red-Horned Nightmare Horse paused, understanding Charles's threat. All 3 level 6 Nightmare Horses had fallen silent, while the lower-ranked ones panted heavily behind them, scuffling the ground with their hooves and preparing to charge. The Knights of Hell nervously gripped their weapons. "Get ready to defend," said Zack, his wrist guard shining in the hellfire. He was ready to face the enemy at any time, even though there were over 80 level 5 creatures headed by 3 level 6 ones. However, he couldn't help wondering if Charles had gone crazy, provoking so many high-powered enemies. "Nobody move," called Charles. "Elena, Miranda, make sure everyone stays put. Nobody follows me." He turned away from the Nightmare Horse to survey the area. "This place is a little small," he said. The horses didn't do anything, but the tension in the air heightened even further. "What's he trying to do?" asked Tina. She had some idea of his plan, but it was so risky that she hoped she was wrong. Miranda had guessed the same thing too. He'd be insane to try that, she thought. The Cerberuses looked on in fascination, thinking that their master's successor was turning out to be a very interesting one indeed. Standing nearby, the 2-headed hellhounds glanced at the Cerberuses. Even if Charles was their master's successor, they couldn't work out how he could hope to succeed against the horses. Even the Cerberuses couldn't figure it out. But they knew he had to take responsibility for his decision. Besides, they understood that if he didn't act at that moment, it would be a long time before he would have a similar opportunity. Charles walked away from the Nightmare Horses. The further he got, though, and the smaller his figure became, the stronger his aura grew. The Nightmare Horses were proud of their lineage. As they had made very clear, they submitted only to the strong. Their submission to the Cerberus Pack didn't mean that they had submitted by default to Charles, too. And even if it turned out that he could best them, that wouldn't prove that the other humans could do the same. Therefore, if the other knights wanted to use them as mounts, they would have to challenge the horses one by one. But that seemed to be irrelevant to the horses, which were confident that they were about to defeat Charles and be done with the whole business. Charles knew that with every visit to Hell, Alice would pay a greater and greater price. Before long, she could be lost to the power of the gate inside her. He was sure that somewhere down the line, they would learn how to control it. But for the time being, he had to make the best use of the expedition to Hell. If he missed the opportunity to win the loyalty of the Nightmare Horses at that moment, he would be putting Alice in danger if the knights needed to return to Hell to try again. He was already ashamed to have put her at risk for the sake of the expedition. He wouldn't be able to forgive himself if he put her in any more danger. After he had gone some distance away from them, he slowed. One of the horses took the chance to charge at Charles. "They're so fast," thought Miranda in wonder. She had the greatest reflexes of all the knights, and even she could only make out the horse as a bolt of black lightning. "Be careful!" shouted Elena, her whole body freezing. Under normal circumstances, her first instinct at seeing Charles in danger would have been to draw her sword. But the horse had sped off so quickly, she hadn't had time. It crossed that distance in 5 seconds, Miranda thought. She wasn't sure if any of her powers would have been able to stall it, not even her sword energy. The black lightning galloped directly at Charles with such speed that the knights wondered how they could have hoped to dodge it if they had been in his shoes. But then they saw the horse shoot straight past Charles. Miranda heaved a sigh of relief as she realized that even with his back to the Nightmare Horse, he had managed to dodge it. It was difficult to make out what was happening so far in the distance, but the horse seemed to falter as it passed Charles. This worried Miranda, who second-guessed if she had really seen Charles dodge the horse, or if it had struck him on its way past. "What's going on over there?" she asked, focusing her vision until she could see that Charles was alive and well. Looking closer, she saw that he was holding something large and black in his left hand. He raised it high, and the knights gasped when they saw what it was. He was bearing aloft the horse's head. Clearly, he hadn't only dodged the Nightmare Horse's charge in the nick of time, but had also sliced its head off. They were stunned by their leader's sword skills. "How did he do it?" asked Elena. She was partly impressed and partly horrified. Charles dropped the head into the dirt. If he had meant to provoke the rest of the Nightmare Horses, he had definitely succeeded. He faced the 80-plus level 5 horses and their level 6 leaders, who patted the ground, snorting and whinnying in fury. Before long, more bolts shot through the air as one by one the horses galloped toward Charles. They moved with such speed that they left sparks in their wake. Charles didn't lose his nerve. He dodged each horse with ease, swinging his hell sword in calm but effective movements. Looking on, the knights trembled with fear at the scene that unfolded in front of them like a hideous dance. "Now this is a battle," thought Charles. He felt no fear as he took on the stampede. In fact, he was a little excited. His plan to subjugate the Nightmare Horses was clear. Alone with one sword, he would take them all on until they saw that he truly was more powerful than them. Charles's body became a blur as he dodged the bolts of black lightning. He moved so fast that they seemed almost to pass through him. Before long, he left the corpses of many Nightmare Horses littered on the ground around him. "It's been a long time since I felt like this," he thought in frenzied excitement, wiping the blood from his face with the back of his hand. He hadn't encountered so many powerful enemies at once since he had been reborn. In his new life, he had focused most of his time and energy on refining weapons for himself and his team. Although weapon refining was crucial if they were to achieve victory, it had distracted him from his main goal, which was to develop his own strength. Even when he had faced difficult battles in his new life, he had often been so low on soul energy that they had gone by in a desperate blur. Now, though, he was strong, and he was enjoying himself. The Nightmare Horses spread out surrounding him. They had realized this was a better strategy than approaching all from the same direction. Then they charged from every side, leaving him no chance of escape. When he realized his predicament, Charles smiled. Although he wasn't as fast as the horses, his preservation ability allowed him to predict their movements. This meant that he could not only make his attacks as accurate as possible, but he could also use their attacks against them. Just at the point that one of the horses was about to collide with him, he leapt into the air, extending his leap by pressing down on the back of the horse. Meanwhile, he swung his Hell Sword down to strike the creature. He used the horse's speed against it, forcing it to charge into his blade with much more power than he would have managed with his strength alone. Without the time to alter its course, the horse was cut in half without Charles spending much effort at all. He used this technique over and over, relying on the power of his blade and the speed of the horses to defeat them. All he needed to do was place the sword in the right position and keep it steady. There was one downside to his strategy. Each time he landed, another nightmare horse would be upon him, ready to gore him with its horn. If he was struck even once, he would be done for. 3 more horses were almost upon him, excitement in their eyes, sure that they were about to destroy him. Just before they reached him, though, Charles turned and pointed at them with the forefinger of his left hand. His sword energy turned his finger as powerful as the sharpest blade, and he brought it down upon the head of the leading horse, splitting its horn down the middle. The level 6 nightmare horses were stunned. As far as they were aware, humans depended entirely on the strength of their weapons to win in battle, so they couldn't understand how Charles had just used his bare hand to cleave the horse's horn so easily. The only explanation was that he'd used his own hand as a divine weapon, which was proof of an incredibly strong fighter. Charles landed and rolled over. His left hand was stained with blood, but the nightmare horse was in even worse shape, sprawled on the ground with its horn splintered in 2. "He's down and injured," thought the red-horned nightmare horse, furious. It had initially thought it wouldn't need to join the fight, but Charles had gone a step too far, and the horse realized it needed to enter the battle. It ordered a large number of nightmare horses to bolster the crowd surrounding Charles before bolting in his direction. It moved with twice the speed of an ordinary nightmare horse. The others hurried to make way, creating a direct path for their leader. As the red-horned horse approached, Charles threw out his bloody left hand at it, palm up. "I recovered so quickly," thought the horse. "But how?" Panicking, it slowed its approach, hooves bringing up clouds of dirt in its panic, realizing that the blood in Charles's hand wasn't his own, but that of the nightmare horse. In their clash, he hadn't taken any damage at all. "Here comes their leader," thought Charles, facing the red-horned nightmare horse. He admired his opponent just as much as he wanted to defeat it, but in an all-out battle against the majestic and fearsome creature, he couldn't hold back at all. Knowing that it was now or never, he unleashed all his sword energy. Although such a strategy might have risked damage to his body under normal circumstances, he knew that his preservation ability would protect him, as his preservation ability had a strong control over his soul energy, including his sword energy. Combined with his preservation ability, he could feel his sword energy suddenly increase. It could no longer harm him, so he didn't need to worry about holding any of it back. Moreover, sword energy was unique in that the more of it the user used, the stronger it became. Charles stood in the midst of a swirling storm of sword energy. He raised his sword and ignited a lotus flower at its point. Unable to stall its momentum, the red-horned horse was sucked into the maelstrom. The other 2 leveled 6 nightmare horses had already started their charge, but soon turned away, their hooves scrabbling in the dirt as they tried to retreat. They were horrified to watch the immense power coming from a single human. Before long, it subsided, revealing a mound of broken corpses around Charles. Facing the 2 level 6 horses, Charles raised his hand. In his fist, he gripped a single red horn. Did I go overboard? Charles wondered. He couldn't help feeling a little regretful. The red-horned nightmare horse had been so strong that he hadn't felt able to hold back in his onslaught. Once the storm of sword energy had passed, he looked around until he had killed 20 of the level 5 nightmare horses. Seeing the red horn in his hand, the 2 surviving level 6 nightmare horses lowered their heads in submission. Watching their leaders do so, the other nightmare horses couldn't help but take the same stance. Charles looked around him. In one short but bloody conflict, he had killed a third of the nightmare horses, and had taken power of the remaining 2/3. As a mark of respect, he used the fire exorcism amulet to cremate the red-horned nightmare horse's body with true fire. This was a genuine mark of respect in Hell, where bodies left behind would be scavenged by the many hungry creatures native to the area. He kept the red horn. When fighting on horseback, it was important to wield a spear of some kind. and since he had entrusted his silver spear to the Cerberus pack, the horn would make a fine replacement, while also showing his respect for the horse he had taken it from. The knights were stunned to see the nightmare horses bow to Charles. No wonder he never asked for our loyalty, Tina thought. Who would ever dare to betray him? The other knights were thinking along the same lines. They also reflected on the fact that they wouldn't have fared anywhere near as well as Charles if it had been them facing the horses. Most importantly, they wouldn't have known how to handle the horses' lightning speed. Charles, meanwhile, had used their speed to his advantage. They felt weak in his presence, and were grateful that he hadn't yet chosen to use his powers against them. Do any of us even come close to his power? Miranda wondered, wondering if all her hard work had been in vain. She had known him capable of great cruelty, but would never have expected him to annihilate so many of the beings he was aiming to exert control over. "Just what we'd expect from our master's successor," roared one of the Cerberuses. It had seen that even though Charles was slower than the horses, he had still been able to beat them. In a way, that made his victory even more impressive. The Cerberus sighed with relief at finding such a worthy successor to its master, a human who seemed capable of anything. "Which of you would like to be my steed?" Charles asked, looking over the nightmare horses. His eyes lingered on the two level 6 horses. After he had exerted his dominance so clearly, he wasn't in a hurry to sign the contract with the creatures. But even though he had been granted the Hellhounds and had subdued the Cerberus pack, he was still in need of a suitable mount. Although he could ride a Hellhound if need be, the Hellhounds weren't as fast as the nightmare horses, nor could they carry as much weight. They might do for the time being, but their shortcomings would eventually get in the way. His preference would have been to take the red-horned horse as his steed, but it had quickly become clear to him that killing the horse was his only way of subduing the rest. At best, without killing the leader, he would only have been able to take control of a few of the weaker horses. He had come to learn that for every gain, it was necessary to make a sacrifice. "Our master actually has a better option," said one of the level 6 horses. Charles raised his eyebrows. "And what would that be?" he asked. The two level 6 horses looked uneasily at one another. "Among the nightmare horses in this territory, there are those of a royal bloodline," said the second. "In fact, it's so powerful that we've been hiding from them." "Royal bloodline?" asked Charles. Then he realized what they were talking about. "You don't mean the purple blood stallions?" His eyes lit up. He hadn't expected such a pleasant surprise. "We know them as the Purple Lightning Herd," said the level 6 horse. Charles didn't care about this small detail. "This is very interesting indeed," he said. According to legend, the royal family of the nightmare horses were able to break through to a higher level than the other horses. He was also tempted by the fact that if he could subdue the royal family, he would be able to use it to subdue even more nightmare horses. The eyes of the Cerberuses glowed with anger. The nightmare horses had never made them privy to this information. However, they recognized that the horses had just submitted to Charles, and so they kept their silence. "The nightmare horses submit only to the strong," said the level 6 nightmare horse. "Trying to take control of the Purple Lightning Herd isn't a task for the faint-hearted. However, you have already shown that you are a formidable warrior. Even if our king wants to fight you himself, I'm sure you will win." Even with the death of the red-horned horse, the surrender of the nightmare horses wasn't unconditional. It was still necessary for them to enter into a contract of equals. Even a great lord of hell would need to abide by this rule if they wanted to subdue the horses. The horses' second condition was that they could only surrender when they were at the height of their powers. In other words, if Charles tried to take advantage of the situation and subdue his potential mount before the horse had matured, then the horse would be well within its rights to turn on him when it finally matured. Of course, if he still had the strength to defeat the horse at its peak ability, that would be another matter. "That's great news," said Charles, nodding. "Bring the Purple Lightning Herd to me." The level 6 nightmare horses gave some orders to the other nightmare horses, who then left to do their bidding. Just then, Miranda came to Charles's side. "Miranda, what do you think you're doing?" asked Charles. He could sense murderous intent emanating from her body. Her facial expression, body language, everything about her told him she was about to launch herself into something very dangerous. I'm glad I'm not about to be on the receiving end of whatever she's planning, he thought. Miranda replied, You told us just now that the Nightmare Horse will only acknowledge someone if they can personally defeat it, didn't you? Charles nodded, but before he could reply, she said, So I need to defeat it. Charles could see the fighting spirit shining brightly in her eyes. He knew she was right. Even if the others signed a contract with the Nightmare Horses, only Charles would be able to summon them and make them obey his orders, unless the others could prove themselves worthy by defeating the horses in battle as he had. But you're not familiar with the way these creatures fight, he said to her. Don't be so reckless. I defeated them by using my powers in exactly the right way. Just inflicting brute force won't work. Charles's preservation ability had let him predict the Nightmare Horse's movements and react much faster than normal. If it hadn't been for that, he wouldn't have been able to defeat them so easily. A level 5 Nightmare Horse walked toward Charles and Miranda, whinnying something out in the language of hell, and the level 6 Nightmare Horse helped to translate for it. That's right, it said, speaking for the level 5 horse. If you want our recognition, come and defeat me. I don't fear death. If you kill me, it will show that you have the ability to defeat the others. So if I can defeat one of the level 5 horses, you'll take that to mean I can defeat all of them, she said. Sounds good to me. She walked some 30 paces away from the level 5 Nightmare Horse. Turning to face the horse, she pulled out her sword and pointed it at it. Let's fight, she shouted. You shouldn't increase the distance between you before the fight, the level 6 horse shouted as it watched. That will give us an advantage. Our power is in our sprinting. Without their special sprinting ability, Nightmare Horses would be little different from any other level 5 beings. Not all enemies would give Nightmare Horses enough room to sprint in battle, so learning how to distance themselves was a vital skill for them. A fair battle distance had always been 5 paces, and anyone who could defeat a Nightmare Horse from a greater distance had always been considered to be very strong indeed. But Miranda was determined to do it her way. I'm standing here, and we'll do it like this, she shouted. She's been warned, thought the level 5 Nightmare Horse. If she starts fighting from there, she's asking for trouble. If she doesn't die here, she'll die on another battlefield with an attitude like that. Seeing Miranda gearing up to fight the horse from so far away, Dale and the others became alarmed. Come on, said Dale to Charles. Tell her she's being an idiot. How could she possibly defeat the Nightmare Horse giving it so much space? Zack nodded and said, If I had to fight one, I'd be able to win if I didn't give it a chance to sprint. But if there were a good distance between us, it'd accelerate faster than I could release my superpower. There's no way she can win from back there. The horse is just too fast. Everyone had seen how fast the Nightmare Horse could run in the last fight. As it had sped up, it had looked like a streak of black lightning. Even for people with good eyesight, it had been very difficult to see its movements clearly. Hitting it was extremely difficult, and winning against it seemed nigh on impossible to the knights. If she gets hit by its horn, it'll be instant death, Zack muttered. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, Miranda, you can't do this! You know how fast it'll run at that distance? Don't be stupid! But Miranda wouldn't listen, and Zack knew that only Charles would be able to persuade her. Despite everything, Charles remained silent. I know how proud and independent she is, he thought, and she'd obey me if I ordered her not to fight, but she usually knows her own strengths and limitations. I want to get on with this, she shouted to Charles, and she pointed her sword at the Nightmare Horse, her eyes full of determination. Charles had just defeated a whole herd of Nightmare Horses by himself. Even the leader of the herd had fallen under his sword. With so much power, did Charles really need anyone else to fight with him? I need to do this, thought Miranda. They all know I'm capable of winning. They've seen me in action plenty of times, and they know how strong I am. But I want to become even stronger. Miranda's determination grew, and she felt as if she had become one with her blood-drinking sword. The Nightmare Horse began to sprint, and after only 10 yards or so, its body became a streak of black lightning. Only the highest-level troops could still see it. Charles and his fighters held their breath, knowing that if the Nightmare Horse hit Miranda with its horn, she would die instantly. She has to dodge it, Charles thought. He knew that weaving about would make it much more difficult for the horse to land the attack, and it would lose some of its power. In a one-on-one fight, that could be the difference between life and death. But seeing the black lightning hurtling toward her, Miranda didn't show any signs of dodging away from its path. Do you want to die? Shouted the nightmare horse as it barreled toward her, eager to kill this human who seemed not to care that she was facing an immense power and certain death. Right at that moment, Miranda ran straight at the horse, the blood-drinking sword in her hand turning into a dazzling white light aimed at its horn. Charles's troops looked on in horror. "What's she doing?" yelled Zack to Charles. "Is she crazy? She has to know she'll die." But there was no time for anyone to shout a warning to her. The bright white light of her blood-drinking sword met the dark lightning of the nightmare horse head-on. The dazzling white light from Miranda's blood-drinking sword collided with the black lightning streak of the nightmare horse's speeding body, as the Knights of Hell looked on in horror, almost unable to breathe. Miranda had known that phenomenal speed was the monster's superpower, and had chosen to face it head-on, despite the warnings shouted at her by Zack and the others. She and the nightmare horse had both condensed and concentrated their strength to the extreme, and face to face, nose to nose, their superpowers had collided. They both came to a shuddering halt, and everyone around them held their breath and waited for what felt like hours to see what would happen next. "Who won?" asked Zack. But no one answered. They were too focused on what was unfolding before them. It was difficult to tell exactly what was happening, but then the air cleared. "Look!" shouted Dale. "Its horn! Look at its horn!" The horn on top of the nightmare horse's head had cracked open, and spiderweb-like cracks continued to spread until the entire horn shattered into small fragments. As soon as the horn had disintegrated, the nightmare horse's body began to split in half, and it fell powerlessly to the ground. Miranda sheathed her sword, turned around, and walked toward Charles and the others. Everyone looked at her with renewed respect and fell silent as Charles started to speak. "You just witnessed the power of someone who understands the strength of their superpowers and how best to use them," he said with pride in his voice. Miranda learned the lightning sword ability on her own and was brave enough to try it in battle. Everyone who awakens at whatever level gains some knowledge in superpowers, but not everyone uses that knowledge properly. Miranda has learned well, and you've seen the results here today. Miranda was delighted to hear such high praise from Charles. "I won't be left behind by you," she said to him, smiling. The rest of the troops knew Charles and Miranda had a very close relationship, but even so, they were surprised to hear him praise her so publicly, and to watch her to give such a bold reply. "You've done well," he told her. "It's not often we see someone with such innate understanding of their powers. There's little out there that'll threaten you now." Charles knew that since Miranda had learned the lightning sword ability in such a short time, her combat skills had to be at their peak. She was even comparable with Zack, and Charles knew that she would very soon be one of the most powerful fighters on the planet. The level 6 nightmare horse turned to Miranda. "We acknowledge your strength," it said, "and when you've signed the contract, you'll be able to summon us to fight for you at any time." A level 5 nightmare horse walked over to stand by Miranda's side and bowed its head in submission. She realized the horse had granted her permission to ride it, and she jumped onto its back. "I'm going to test the nightmare horse's speed," she said to Charles, adrenaline still coursing through her veins from the fight. And with that, she dug her heels into its flanks, and off they shot. Miranda had to grab the horse's mane to stop herself from falling off. The speed of the nightmare horse's takeoff had taken her by surprise. As the horse galloped faster than any she had seen before, Miranda laughed and held on for the ride. The Knights of Hell looked on enviously. The nightmare horse was so much faster than any horse they had ever ridden, and each one of them wished they were up there instead of Miranda. Charles could see jealousy written across their faces. "Listen up, everyone," he said. "Your turn will come once you've learned to control yourselves and your powers as effectively as Miranda can. I hope that one day, all of us will be able to ride these nightmare horses and go freely anywhere we want to." The Knights of Hell began to look more enthusiastic and hopeful. Previously, they had followed Charles because he was such a strong leader, and they had learned a great deal from him. Now, though, they had a real goal to reach for, and all of them decided to work as hard as they could on their powers. "But until you reach the required level, you'll ride the two-horned horses," he added. The knights all turned to look at the horses. When the two-horned horses had first appeared, the knights had been excited at the prospect of riding them, because these mounts would help them to increase their strength and speed. But looking at the two-horned horses after seeing the nightmare horses in battle, They wondered if they even dare ride them. If they were so far off being able to fight a nightmare horse, were they even capable of riding a two-horned horse? We'll just have to look forward to riding nightmare horses in the future, one of the knights said to the others, and they all agreed as they mounted the two-horned horses. Under the command of Tina, Hugh, and the others, they began to practice their riding skills. Because there were nightmare horses all around them, the Knights of Hell felt less afraid of riding the two-horned horses, which didn't seem nearly as terrifying in comparison, so their practice went well, and their confidence increased. Charles despised the two-horned horses as inferior beings, and they weren't well treated by the Knights of Hell. In Hell, integrity and dignity could only be earned through strength, so the two-horned horses were looked down upon as the lowest of the low. Even though everyone else had mounted their horses, Elena was still standing beside Charles. "What's wrong? Why aren't you practicing with all the others?" he asked. Elena looked pointedly in the direction of one of the nightmare horses and said, "I want to ride one of those." "Are you sure you want to ride a nightmare horse?" Charles asked Elena. He knew that Miranda's example had inspired several of the knights, but he was worried that Elena wanted to compete with Miranda's achievement and would do something foolish in the process. "I can feel that the Terminator sword ability seed you gave me contains a very powerful energy," Elena replied. "When you first gave me it, I couldn't control it properly, but I think that I can control it fully now, so I'll easily be able to defeat a nightmare horse. I have a lot more experience with using and controlling my powers now that I've fought in so many battles." She felt that she wasn't progressing as quickly as she wanted to do, and this dangerous battle was her chance to really push her limits and increase her strength. "All right then," Charles said as he looked at her. "It's your decision, and I'm not going to stop you." He knew there was nowhere that was absolutely safe, but he trusted Elena's judgment of her own abilities and knew she hated weakness as much as death, so he respected her decision. When the Knights of Hell realized that Elena had asked to duel with a nightmare horse, they stopped practicing their riding skills and all turned to watch her. Tina grimaced. "At first I was a bit jealous of Elena," she said bitterly. "I always wondered why Charles seemed to favor her, even though we joined the Dawn Alliance before her. But even if I was as strong as she is, I still wouldn't provoke a nightmare horse." Tina knew that if she ever felt confident enough to challenge a nightmare horse, it would only be when she was at her absolute fittest. Hugh and Tommy felt the same. "It's hard not to feel a little bit jealous of Elena," Hugh said, "but we shouldn't let it affect our judgment." "I agree," said Tommy. "Charles is a fair man. If we behave well, he treats us well." Elena's strength came from killing so many zombies and from a huge amount of battle experience. If Tina, Hugh, and Tommy combined all their skills and strength, they would still barely surpass her. Elena was about 10 paces away from the nightmare horse that she wanted to fight. They were facing each other with only that short distance between them. She wasn't as arrogant as Miranda, and so she chose a safer battle tactic. She wanted to defeat her opponent on a level playing field, fair and square. A murmur ran through the onlookers, who wondered whether Elena actually was strong enough and fast enough to take on a nightmare horse and win. But pure strength alone wasn't sufficient to ensure victory. Elena needed speed as well. The duel began with the nightmare horse rushing toward Elena, who turned swiftly and dodged the first charge. The nightmare horse kept running, quickly getting further away from Elena, and it stopped about 50 yards away from her. By dodging its first charge, Elena had given the nightmare horse time to increase its running distance for its next attack, which meant it could pick up more speed. The nightmare horse had a lot of combat experience, and the onlookers realized that its next charge would be much faster than the first one. The knights feared for Elena's life and didn't know if she could fight the monster as successfully as Miranda had done. Miranda's fight with the nightmare horse had made a big impression on them. The nightmare horse paused for a moment at the end of its run, and then it launched another fierce charge. It ran so fast that it quickly turned into a bolt of black lightning as it charged toward Elena, its horn pointing straight at her. If she doesn't make a move very soon, that evil horn will split her in two, Charles thought as he watched the fight. The streak of black lightning whistled past him and hit Elena, who fell to the ground injured. Charles could see that the direct hit had revealed the flexible blue armor hidden beneath her outer combat gear. Charles had customized the blue flame energy gem armor specially for her to protect her in life-threatening situations. "That was close," Tommy said, gasping with relief. "If it wasn't for her blue flame energy gem armor, she might well be dead." "No," said Tina. You're wrong. Blue Flame Energy Gem armor isn't that powerful. Its most important function is to defend against damage from sharp weapons. It allows the force of targeted attacks to spread evenly across the body, giving less impact where the direct hit is taken. So what saved her? Tommy asked. Even if the Blue Flame Energy Gem armor deflected some of the energy from the Nightmare Horse's horn hitting her, surely it couldn't protect her from it entirely. It must have been her Terminator sword ability, said Tina. Don't be jealous, guys, Charles said. Your path is different from Elena's, and you're at a different stage on your journey. At some point in the future, if you can learn to merge your combat skills with your strength, you'll be as strong and capable as she is. You need to learn how to control your powers. He looked back at Elena, who struggled to her feet. When the Nightmare Horse had hit her, she had forcefully merged her Terminator sword ability with her body's natural strength to become strong enough to save her life from the deadly attack. Elena turned around and rushed toward the Nightmare Horse. It also tried to change direction, but as it started to turn, it broke its right leg, causing it to lose its balance and stumble to the ground. Elena dashed forward, slashed the Nightmare Horse's throat with her Crimson Flame sword, and announced quietly, "I win." Very well done, said Charles as he walked over to Elena and the Nightmare Horse. He used the revival amulet with its life-giving power to help heal them both. I'm still far from being at the peak of my strength, Elena said, sounding disappointed. I wanted to make my Terminator sword ability stronger, but it feels as though half of its power is still dormant. You did very well, said Charles, but it's not all about increasing your physical strength. The weakness you feel at the moment's only temporary. The most important thing to focus on is your spiritual strength. You might not realize it, but you chose to hold back when you won the battle just now. I don't really know what you mean, Elena replied. Instead of instinctively using the power of your Terminator sword ability to stab an already seriously injured opponent, you held back, knowing you'd already done enough to win, explained Charles. That means you have a good basic grasp of your own strength, unlike many people who don't understand that restraint is a form of strength. Charles's friend, Archer Wells, had been one of those people. A warrior who had reached the peak of human strength and skill, Archer had obtained 9 Water Mansion tokens and the final artifact, but he still hadn't fully understood the immensity of heaven and earth. Translating all of his skills into strength had required more time than he had been willing to give. He had always been impatient, and it had led to his downfall. On the other hand, Elena had the highest tally of kills after Charles, and she never held back in battle. She always used all of her skills to give her opponents no chance of survival. That aspect of combat seemed deeply rooted in her being. Charles knew that on any other battlefield, the Nightmare Horse would have died. But at the last moment, Elena had controlled her basic instinct to kill. She had chosen, instead, to disable the Nightmare Horse, which showed Charles that she already understood her strength and how to use it to the greatest effect. Ordinary people can't grasp this concept because they just focus on continuously improving their power, thought Charles, and then they become slaves of their own strength instead of using it as a weapon. Once Elena and the Nightmare Horse had recovered, Elena mounted it, and, as a mark of its respect for her, it let her ride. The Nightmare Horse galloped incredibly fast, and Elena was riding bareback. Despite their great speed, her new skills and strength kept her stable, and the ride was exhilarating. The Knights of Hell were all jealous of Elena and Miranda, and realized that if they wanted the same opportunity and prestige, they were going to have to fight for it. If they worked hard and increased their strength, they stood a chance of reaching the same dizzy heights as the two women. The level 6 Nightmare Horse brought a small and seemingly insignificant Nightmare Horse to Charles. The Cerberus next to Charles scoffed at the creature. "So this is part of your royal family," it said. "It must be very wise, because it certainly doesn't look to have much strength." The level 6 Nightmare Horse replied, "Your Cerberus pack hasn't managed to provide us with any protection, so we've developed a special way of protecting ourselves now that the bloodline seal of our royal family has been broken." As it spoke, the level 6 horse rammed his horn into the small horse's scrawny body, and the tiny horse let out an almighty roar. Its body began to grow very rapidly, and in a trice, it was 10 feet long and too tall to measure. Its hair was no longer pure black, but had taken on a shiny indigo hue, and the horn on its head had turned indigo and gold. Its horn looked sharper even than Miranda's blood-drinking sword, and it shone brightly. All the other nightmare horses were forced to bow their heads before it in recognition of this member of their royal bloodline. Charles's eyes lit up. The great beast in front of him was one of the purple nightmare horse herd, part of the nightmare horse royal family. There were several royal bloodlines, including the purple nightmare horse, the scarlet nightmare horse, and the golden nightmare horse. Charles knew that the red-horned nightmare horse had been part of the scarlet nightmare horse royal bloodline, but that line was comparatively weak, and their power couldn't flow fully, meaning its awakening had failed. Even so, its running speed had been twice as fast as an ordinary nightmare horse. The newly awakened purple nightmare horse, however, could be seen as a member of the most powerful bloodline of the nightmare horse royal family, and Charles was very excited to see it. The creature had the highest growth rate of any of the royal bloodlines and could easily reach level 8. Ordinary nightmare horses could only hope to reach level 7 at the most, and many struggled to reach level 6. Once the purple nightmare horse had awakened its bloodline power, as long as it wasn't injured or killed before becoming fully awakened, reaching level 9 was almost certain. Charles knew that if he could tame the purple nightmare horse, he would never need to find another mount. Looking at the horse, Charles could see there was some doubt in its eyes. Could this man be my master? It wondered. Does he have the right powers, wisdom, skills, and understanding to take control of my family and bloodline? Charles wasn't at all concerned by the doubt he could see on the horse's face. He knew he had the necessary attributes, and just needed to show the creature how easily he could control it. Evil suppressing amulet, called Charles, as he pressed the amulet against the horse's head. The horse let out a loud howl as it tried to resist the power of the amulet, but as the pain eased, it could see in its spiritual mind's eye a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. At the peak of the mountain of corpses, it could see a man standing victorious. The purple nightmare horse knew that man was Charles. The purple nightmare horse realized that, although its royal bloodline had awakened, it had not yet reached the full potential of its strength. But having seen Charles atop a mountain of corpses in its mind, it knew that it had to serve and obey him, so it bowed its noble head in submission. It could tell that the evil suppressing amulet had been merely a medium. The one who had truly tamed the beast within was the one who had used the amulet, and that was Charles. Charles had fought and won many battles, and had faced countless desperate situations. His combat skills and strength were undisputable, and the horse knew it wouldn't be able to withstand any fight with him. I will be honored to serve you, it said to Charles, who easily leaped the great height to sit on its back. The horse turned into a blot of black lightning and sped off into the distance. Charles felt the warm wind whistling past them, and although he wasn't an experienced rider, he used his preservation ability to adapt quickly to riding the purple nightmare horse. Their ride took them past a group of hellish creatures looking for food, but before they had a chance to eat anything, Charles cut off their heads with his hell sword without the purple nightmare horse even slowing its pace. He used the long sword because some of the hellish creatures were too short for him to reach down to kill them with a dagger. The speed of this beast is incredible, he thought. We're covering about 200 yards in 3 seconds. That's 3 times faster than I can run, even at my best. It's a good thing I chose to use my preservation ability. Otherwise, just adapting to this mount would have taken hours of practice. Never mind fighting while I'm riding. He found the horse's level of endurance amazing. It could keep up such a high speed for 2 hours, and if it ran a little slower, it would be possible for it to keep running for 3 days and nights without rest. This beast must be traveling at the speed of a tornado, thought Charles. I wonder if I could use my longest sword at this speed. How powerful would it be? No wonder the Nether Knights are so terrifying. If a spiral sword was swung riding at such a fast speed, it would produce a terrifying force. Any level 8 expert who wasn't a good swordsman at speed would be in danger. Charles felt very proud that he had managed to kill the hellish creatures using a longsword while riding at such high speed. In an earlier age, the cavalry had brought great pressure to bear in battle on the Central Plains, and the nomadic tribes in the north had directly changed the way war chariots were used. However, in the post-apocalyptic era, where resources were scarce, logistics prevented the use of the cavalry. But this was hell, and that same logistical pressure no longer existed. If I can bring the Knights of Hell to their full potential, What an amazing knighthood that will be. The nightmare of all our enemies, Charles thought. Having tamed the purple nightmare horse, Charles felt some of the depression that had always been part of his life lifting, and his heart lightened. The pressure that came from trying to survive and protecting the people around him was also less than it had been for some time. Charles knew so much about the future that he understood despair better than anyone, and those who hadn't experienced that hopeless future couldn't come close to understanding him and the pressures he faced. But now things feel very different, he thought. Now that I'm so strong and can fight astride this super fast beast, I feel confident enough to face the future. No matter what the future holds, I'll walk with my head held high and won't ever need to hide from anyone again. After the purple nightmare horse had been running for about half an hour, they began to slow down and drew to a gradual halt. In front of them lay a forbidden zone, making it impossible for the horse to tread there. "It's the forest of death," it said to Charles. Charles was startled and looked at the densely packed trees ahead of them. Even the hellfire couldn't cause any damage to such a thick forest. The forest of death was a remarkably dangerous place. Charles took out an explosive flame amulet. The gleaming true fire from within formed a ball of powerful fire that exploded in the forest. Charles dismounted and rushed toward the trees with his hell sword in his hand. With the help of his innate sword energy, he swept his hell sword across the area, and in the blink of an eye, he felled more than a dozen trees. But then the branches and roots of nearby trees started to move, forming a cage to try to enclose Charles. But he swiftly wielded his sword again, and the attacking trees were sliced down. Watching Charles exhibiting such great prowess in dealing with the forest, the purple nightmare horse's eyes began to shine with admiration. It had originally submitted to Charles under the evil suppressing amulet's power, but now it could see that was only one of Charles's many special powers. The horse began to worship him. The trees in the forest had also sensed Charles's great power. They were intelligent beings and could tell they were in the presence of greatness, so they didn't dare to continue to threaten or fight him. But just as Charles heaved a sigh of relief, a vine with blood-red thorns approached him from behind. Charles's sword energy swept across the forest, cutting the vines with blood-red thorns into several pieces. After destroying the vines that had tried to attack him, Charles followed the direction they came from and chased after them. His breathing labored. Along the way, his sword energy cut through countless trees and thorns. In less than a minute, Charles found the source of the vines. They were wrapped around the body of a powerful level 5 tree demon. The vine's thickest part was as wide as Charles's thigh, and their thorns could even pierce through the body of a level 5 warrior. Charles swung his sword and cut off the tree demon's branch as it tried to attack him. Then he used his soul energy to speak to the tree. "Surrender now or I'll destroy you," he yelled defiantly. The ability to communicate with other beings using soul energy was something that ordinary people could only control after reaching level 6, but he had mastered it in advance. His nameless ancient book assisted him in controlling skills that were above his level. Charles cut off the blood-red vines and tree branches as easily as cutting through butter. Soon after, the tree demon quickly chose to submit. In the environment of hell, where the strong were respected above all else, a mere level 5 being wouldn't hesitate to surrender to a stronger foe to ensure its survival. Charles didn't use the evil suppressing amulet to tame the tree demon, but instead placed it and the blood-red vines around it into the energy storage space. The space's development was progressing according to his plans, and the crops there were already growing and being harvested. But he couldn't use his will to control everything in the space at all times, so he needed some help to take care of it. He believed that if he could control the problem of food and clothing supplies, he would attract people from all over the world to Dawn City. Because of this, ensuring the energy storage space and the crops inside were tended to properly was of utmost importance to him. However, he was unwilling to expose the space's secret to others. It was safe to tell others that he had a portable storage space. After all, space-powered people all possessed one, and with his strength, he was qualified to own it. No one would dare to question him if he mentioned it. But if he revealed that he possessed a small world inside of it that included living beings, the impact would be sensational. Because creating such a world was related to the Satan level, a level of obsession and madness. Since he could capture other beings and bring them into the energy storage space to tend to the crops, he didn't need to ask anyone for help and reveal his secret. But he felt that capturing more people to work his farms was stooping to a new low. He feared that if he continued to act so callously, sooner or later he would become someone who didn't even know himself and his family. No matter how strong Charles became, if he was no longer himself, what was the point of surviving? The treants in the Forest of Death were the companion species of the tree demons, and the forest was full of thousands of them. Whether it was planting medicinal herbs or farming crops, the tree-like creatures exhibited great talent. Many powerful beings who wanted to settle in a territory liked to plant the tree ants there, and let them help take care of their gardens and fields. After collecting some tree ants for his energy storage space, Charles still wasn't satisfied, so he collected a portion of the soil beneath them and put it inside too. It wasn't his fault that he was a pack rat. After experiencing the post-apocalyptic era in his past life, where resources have been scarce, he wasn't willing to let go of any valuable items. After he had dug up a 3-foot pile of soil and had placed it along with everything else into the energy storage space, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and an indescribable fear grew within him. Charles got on his horse without hesitation, then he ordered the horse to run toward where everyone was gathered. At that moment, his energy preservation ability warned him that something was amiss. He sensed a powerful presence casting its eyes on the forest, a terrible force that couldn't be resisted. Although Charles didn't know how strong his opponent was, he was very clear about the danger he was in. His strength could sweep across the human world without much difficulty, but there were too many beings in hell that could overpower him for him to let his guard down. Not to mention the looming threat of powerful beings like the Lord of the Underworld, who could kill him with just a slap. In hell, the strong were respected, and the weak knew their place. Charles realized he was outmatched. If he didn't want to bow to the strong like everyone else in hell, then he had to escape ahead of time. After he had run away for 10 minutes, his fear slowly faded, and he calmed down. And to think I thought I was invincible when such powerful forces exist here, he thought with a chuckle. A rapid increase in strength like he had experienced could easily change one's mentality and make one arrogant. Charles's temperament was good, but he wasn't immune to the effects of his newfound power. Moreover, he had already gained a lot during his time in hell. He had collected a few tree demons and more than 2,000 tree ants. If he trained them well, his energy storage space would become a stable base for him. He knew that his greed in collecting so many things had attracted the powerful being's attention, and he didn't want to push his luck and try to take anything else. After Charles returned to where the Knights of Hell were gathered, everyone happily surrounded him. The Knights had adapted to their 2-horned horse mounts, but many had suffered severe injuries in doing so. They'd encountered quite a setback during the training process. However, there had been no casualties, and Helen was able to heal the Knights' wounds. After Charles' return, everyone could roughly control their mounts enough to circle him with them and control their approximate direction. He knew that if they were given some time to adapt, they could rapidly improve their skills. After seeing Helen, Charles handed a few seeds to her. "Do you know what type of seeds these are?" he asked. Helen looked at the few red seeds in her hands. The wood power in her body grew restless, as if it had encountered something incredibly enticing. "These are hellthorn seeds," Charles said. "Wood power possessors can control plants. I know that most of the plants in nature are worthless to you, and even if you control them, they won't help you much. But hellthorn seeds are different. As long as you make good use of them, you'll be able to improve your power greatly." He realized she didn't fully understand what he meant, so he pointed at the Nightmare Horse. "If you can fully control the power of these seeds, you can ride the Nightmare Horse. Their power will become your power." Although Helen had felt the seeds' hidden potential when Charles had first handed them to her, she wasn't sure what was so special about them. But learning that she could use them to ride the Nightmare Horse excited her. She knew she would never be as powerful as Charles, and she had doubted that she would ever reach even Miranda or Elena's level of strength. So she was shocked to hear that if she could figure out how to use the hellthorn seeds, she would possess the same strength as those powerful women. "I'll use these well," she said, clenching her fists tightly around the seeds. No one would be able to take them from her. The abundant harvest of resources from the trip to hell had far exceeded Charles's expectations. Before returning to the human world, he gave the Knights of Hell some time to practice, so they could familiarize themselves with the fighting style of cavalry using their new two-horned horse mounts. While the knights were adapting to new battle techniques, Charles followed the Cerberus to visit the Cerberus pack. Charles had helped the Cerberuses and the two-headed hellhounds to partially suppress their curse, but he hadn't completely removed it from them. He didn't want to consume too much energy doing so, and he also wanted to protect the Cerberus pack. If just a few Cerberuses had recovered from the curse, then it would seem like a coincidence. After all, there were endless treasures in hell, so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for a few members of the pack to find a way to cure themselves. But if the entire pack suddenly recovered, then the powerful beings in hell would take notice, and the pack would face calamity. Therefore, the most important thing for the Cerberus pack at that moment was to help Charles grow strong enough to help them without fear of retaliation from the other forces in hell. Moreover, even if they completely suppressed the curse that contaminated their bloodline, it would still take a certain amount of time to unleash their bloodline's full power. This also would require the Cerberus pack's concerted efforts. After helping some hellhounds to suppress the curse, the Cerberus that Charles was most familiar with ordered its packmates to bring some dark dwarves to Charles. "When our master settled here, he kept some dark dwarves in captivity," the Cerberus said. "However, after he went missing, the dark dwarves found themselves in trouble, and we don't have the strength to protect them. I heard that the Dark Dwarf clan is very good at forging. I hope they can be of use to you." Charles had become the shining hope of the Cerberus pack. He was the dawn that they had been waiting for countless years, but they were afraid that the powerful forces in the area would notice if they gave Charles too many resources and would try to stop him. However, they knew that the dwarves wouldn't directly increase his strength, and so they wouldn't attract any further suspicion. The Cerberus pack was in a sorry state, and they no longer had the strength to continue caring for the dwarves. But since the dwarves were a legacy left by their old master, the Cerberus pack wasn't willing to give up on them so easily. So they decided to give them to Charles instead. In any case, the Cerberus pack's loyalty mark had already been transferred to Charles, which meant that he was the true successor of the old master. The pack thought that since their master's successor was willing to help them, they might as well have him reduce some of their burdens. Seeing the hundreds of dark dwarves with dull, dazed expressions assembled before him, Charles was taken aback. He was somewhat envious of the Dark Dwarf clan. After all, they were famous for being master blacksmiths. Although they weren't as good as humans when it came to developing divine weapons or special treasures, they were still very skilled at creating standard equipment. It could be said that the Dark Dwarves were born to forge. With their help, Charles wouldn't have to forge many weapons himself. He only needed to oversee the final enchantment of the weapons after they were crafted. The dwarves would significantly increase Charles's efficiency with forging weapons, which would give him more time to study combat and other aspects of warfare. But the Dark Dwarf clan was famous for loving wine and having a huge appetite, and if they weren't allowed to drink wine and eat to their heart's content, they would slack off. The once bountiful Earth had been ravaged by the apocalypse. Most food could only be found in zombie territory, and growing or collecting food was a time-intensive and dangerous process. Because Charles had experienced the food crisis in his past life, even though he had room in his energy storage space to house the dwarves, he hesitated to accept them. Seeing Charles's hesitant look, a few of the taller dwarves, who were just over 3 feet tall, approached him. "Please, take us in," one begged. "We promise not to drink wine, and we can forge divine weapons for you. We can do anything as long as you're willing to take us in as our new master." Charles was dumbfounded, and he turned to the Cerberus in confusion. Aren't dark dwarves known for having a bad temper? He wondered. Why are they acting like this now? When it realized the bemused way Charles was looking at it, the Cerberus turned its 3 heads unnaturally, not daring to meet his gaze. "The environment in this region is very poor," the Cerberus explained. "We can't even eat our fill. The fact that we took care of the Dark Dwarf clan until now means our relationship with our master is intense. Originally, there were tens of thousands of Dark Dwarfs here, but these are all that's left." Looking back at the Dark Dwarf's pleading face, Charles's face twitched. There was no place for pride in hell, and creatures on the lower rungs of power could only accept whatever cards they were dealt and make the best of them if they wanted to survive. But the Dark Dwarf clan's temper was indeed intense, and many of the dwarves were unwilling to go against their principles even if they died because of it. The environment of Hell was so harsh that even the Cerberuses had to go to the farthest reaches of the underworld to search for food. The Dark Dwarves couldn't hunt on their own in Hell, so the trials of life there had destroyed most of their clan. The dwarves who couldn't adapt enough to survive had already died, and those who had survived found their lives much more difficult due to their dwindling numbers. If the dwarves don't drink wine and only need food, then I can afford to raise them, Charles thought. He needed to use some of his strength to obtain more food, so he had to carefully weigh whether taking in the dwarves was worth the energy it would cost him. Since the dwarves no longer desired wine, he realized that their value would exceed the amount of resources he would need to sacrifice for them. Although he had heard that if dark dwarves didn't drink, their forging skill would drop significantly, he knew that no matter how poor their production was, it would be enough for his needs. After all, 1,000 ordinary weapons were more valuable on the battlefield than just a handful of divine weapons that could slice through iron like paper. He also knew that if his energy storage space could form a complete environment, then the dwarves could also create more benefits for him. And if they couldn't sustain themselves there, then they wouldn't survive. So the problem of having enough to feed them would be self-limiting. After smoothly putting the dwarves into the energy storage space, Charles sighed and said, "Hell isn't all bad, but it sure is dangerous." During his short trip to Hell, Charles had gathered countless resources and had increased his and his knights' power significantly. But he knew that without the help of the Cerberus pack, he wouldn't be able to obtain anything else. The pack had helped the Knights of Hell survive, and their help had allowed Charles and the Knights to enter Hell in the first place. As Charles thought about his next move, he felt a disturbance in his energy storage space. Is there something wrong with the Dark Dwarves? Charles wondered. Sensing danger coming from the energy storage space, he shifted his attention there. But as he surveyed the area, he heaved a sigh of relief. He realized the energy storage space was simply warning him that it was approaching the limits of its capacity after he had placed the dwarves inside. The land inside the energy storage space had a limit to how many crops it could produce and beings it could support. And as a level 5 paranormal, Charles could only expand the space so much before he reached his limit too. He had purposely restricted the development of the energy storage space, so the number and quality of creatures that could be accommodated inside were also limited. When collecting materials, there were no capacity issues. But Charles had collected many tree ants in the Forest of Death, which had brought a huge burden to the space. Although the energy storage space has reached its limit, it won't collapse for a while, he thought. If I maintain this speed of growth, it'll be able to sustain itself for at least 5 to 6 months. To prevent the space from damaging my foundation, I have to advance a level further within 3 months, or collect more soul energy. As the energy storage space grew, it continuously absorbed soul energy from the void. Although Charles didn't know the source of the energy, he appreciated any help he could get with maintaining the space. The living beings in the energy storage space also consumed soul energy, and they absorbed more of the energy than the void could provide. But because the space had some soul energy stored, it could still support itself for a few months, despite the influx of new creatures. The energy storage space was important to him, so he didn't dare to gamble on the consequences of its collapse. He knew he would have to find a way to gather more energy or increase his cultivation level. 3 months is enough to sort this out, he thought. Since he could rely on the stored soul energy to sustain the space for 3 months, Charles felt he didn't have to worry about anything. He had an entire city to serve him, and everyone there was working for him. If he could collect just one crystal core from every Daunian, it would be enough energy to supply the energy storage space for months to come. Now that I have the tree ants, I can finally put the liches to rest, he thought. With that single thought, Charles killed all the liches in the energy storage space that had been responsible for planting and tending to the crops. Since he had the dark dwarves and the tree ants, he had no need for the liches anymore. He didn't feel right making humans as servants, even if they were technically already dead. He felt it was immoral and barbaric. Because humans stood at the top of the food chain, they could control the life and death of most other creatures. But if humans killed other beings just for the sake of killing and not for survival, they were just hurting the weak to vent their own negative emotions. Charles knew that if he didn't watch himself as he grew more powerful, he could lose his last bit of humanity and become an even more terrible creature than the monsters he fought. So he killed the liches to free them from their servitude, and handed the farm work within the energy storage space to the tree ants. Then he assigned the exploration and forging work to the dark dwarves. After killing the liches, Charles felt the pressure in the energy storage space lessen. Next, the Cerberus pack handed over some ores and other things that they didn't need to Charles, including the dark dwarves' smithy, which held a set of training equipment. After receiving all of the resources, Charles reluctantly gathered his troops and prepared to leave Hell. The gains from his trip to Hell had been so significant that he couldn't help but want to stay there, but he knew that wasn't feasible. Strength was the foundation of everything in Hell, and everything he had acquired there had come either directly or indirectly from the owner of the mysterious ancient book. Charles believed that if he disappointed the Cerberus pack in any way, they would abandon him without hesitation. The Cerberus pack doubted that their old master would choose a successor that would disappoint them, so if Charles made them doubt his capabilities, they would wonder if he was their master's true successor. If Charles wanted more resources, or even to simply protect what he had already acquired, he had to become even stronger. It was a time of swimming against the current, and Charles knew that if he didn't continue fighting to improve his skills, he would sink. When the Knights of Hell returned to the gathering place, they were all panting. They had been busy practicing their combat techniques with each other and were about to reach their limits. A searing hellfire raged everywhere in Hell. If they were careless and fell into the flames, they would be charred until no ashes were left. But through their training, everyone had improved their strength and skills significantly. Although it seemed like they had only obtained mounts, after having survived the harsh environment of Hell and returning to the human world, their strength would advance by leaps and bounds. "All right, everyone," Charles said to the knights. "We can go home now." Charles didn't give too many speeches. Occasionally, he would give them to win people's hearts, but he thought that people who gave too many speeches were usually self-important and full of hot air. He used his actions to gain people's support, and he used speeches only as a means to strengthen his standing. He knew that if he ever made a promise to the people that he couldn't keep, he would suffer a setback that he couldn't afford. Soon after his order, the gate to Hell opened once again. The Knights of Hell lined up and left through the gate with Charles walking behind them. After leaving the dangerous environment of Hell, although they could only see the pitch-black night around them, they could feel their bodies suddenly relaxing. There was no hellfire or unbearable heat blowing against their faces, only fresh air. Seeing Charles and the others return, the upper echelons of Dawn City stopped everything they were doing and gathered around their leader. Charles walked over to Alice. "Thank you for your hard work," he said. Alice shook her head. "It was nothing," she said. "Maintaining the gate of Hell will only make me stronger, though I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. The stronger I become, the more difficult it'll be to control my strength, and eventually that'll mean that I'll die. But I'll do my best to hold that day off as long as possible." Charles held Alice's hand. "Before that day comes, I'll have the power to fight against Hell," he said solemnly. "I'll cut off the other end of the gate of Hell and let you drink its power." "That sounds gross," Alice said in disgust. Then she flashed an amused smile. Dale and the others looked at the two of them and wanted to make fun of them, but after looking at Miranda, they stopped themselves. Since Alice had become Charles's girlfriend, Miranda's position in the group was somewhat awkward. Although it was a time of moral collapse and powerful men could have many lovers, Charles's behavior with so many different women still made the others uncomfortable. Miranda came to Alice's side and held her hand. "I have something I need to say to you," she said. "Come with me for a bit." Alice blinked blankly, taken aback by her request. Although she didn't know what Miranda wanted to say, she still followed her to a private place away from everyone else. Olivia looked at Miranda's back and shook her head. She knew that in the new world, where survival was top priority, a responsible and powerful man like Charles was a valuable partner. That was why she had chosen to get involved with him. However, she didn't know when she would be able to speak openly about their relationship. "Olivia," Charles said, "I'll leave the follow-up training of the Knights of Hell to you." The Knights were the most powerful resource he had, and because Olivia had shown her extraordinary talent in training others, Charles was relieved to hand the responsibility to her. Feeling his trust, Olivia smiled sweetly. "Aren't you afraid that I'll use the Knights to threaten you?" Charles smiled back. "You won't." After he had experienced the darkness of the apocalypse in his past life, and had seen how people had resorted to their base instincts while they had fought for survival, he didn't have much respect for human nature. He knew that testing others would only result in disappointment. But he had confidence in Olivia's intelligence. She knew what she should do and what she shouldn't do, and she had the foresight needed to lead the Knights to victory. A soft murmur came from the group. "What a scumbag!" Anthony and the others turned their heads toward the source of the voice. In Dawn City, the only one who dared to speak to Charles in such a tone was his sister, Lena. She smirked as she looked at him. Charles rubbed his nose, feeling a little awkward. He knew she had already made her mind up about him, so he thought he might as well just keep doing what he was doing without any regard for her opinion. After Charles briefly explained some things, everyone dispersed, and only Olivia remained. Everyone was exhausted after what they had been through, and more than anything else, they needed a rest. Charles had temporarily left his purple nightmare horse mount in Hell. He would summon it when needed. After Charles had left Hell, the Cerberus pack had begun to recover its lost land gradually. With the purple nightmare horse's help, the pack could overpower many other creatures in Hell and take over other territories in turn as they gained momentum like a surging tidal wave. Just as Charles was about to speak to Olivia, he heard Lena and Helen speaking to each other not far from him. "So, I heard you're my brother's biggest fan," Lena said teasingly. "He's a pretty interesting guy," Helen replied, her cheeks flushing red. Lena looked at her warily. "You don't have fantasies about him, do you?" "Is there something wrong with that?" Helen asked calmly. Seeing that Lena still wanted to say something, Helen stopped her. "I know what you want to say," she said. "But now that the times have changed, love is overrated, and survival is everything. I just want to find a reliable and loyal partner, but they're too hard to come by nowadays. If I can't find someone who's both, I'll take the reliable guy over the loyal one any day." Lena sighed. "I know that some women always feel the need to have a man by their side," she said, "and I shouldn't force my own beliefs onto others. It could get them killed. But I can't help but worry about my brother with all these women chasing after him." After Charles and Olivia eavesdropped for a while, they quietly went to Olivia's room. Olivia leaned into Charles's arm. "No matter how fickle someone is, as long as they help others, they shouldn't be called a scumbag," she said. Human morality had changed with the times, and the apocalypse had caused everyone's moral standards to regress significantly. "When I left, did something happen?" Charles asked. He reached under the collar of her shirt and squeezed her shoulder gently. Olivia blushed. "You only left for a day," she said. "How much could happen in such a short time? Though the military did notify us that it won't be long before a new radio system is established." With a functional radio system, Dawn City, which had been cut off from the rest of the world, would be able to communicate with other survival bases and assist them in times of need. "They got the radios up and running already?" Charles thought in shock. His rebirth had caused many butterfly effects. Because he had influenced Kevin, the military had learned martial arts techniques. This had caused their overall strength to be a level higher compared to what it had been at the same point in the apocalypse during Charles's previous life. During that life, by the time his survival base had been able to communicate with the other bases, many of them had already been destroyed. Fortunately for the survivors in Charles's new life, the changes in the timeline and the increased power of humans early on in the apocalypse had allowed them to expand their settlements and increase their chances of survival. In his previous life, Charles had seen countless survival bases destroyed by accidents and unstoppable attacks. The bases had continued to fall one after the other until radio communication had been re-established. Humans are animals that thrive in groups, and after the survivors in Charles's past life had lost their unity due to the communication breakdown, they had lost their most significant natural advantage. Since the radio system is almost functional again already, that means other things have changed in this timeline, and I can't rely on my experience with my past life to predict what will happen next, Charles thought. But since I've established myself in Dawn City, even if things keep changing, I'll be alright. I already died in one apocalypse. What's the worst that could happen in this one? A cold light flashed across his eyes. He knew he still needed to wait for some things to happen, but since so many things had already changed, he didn't need to be patient anymore. Seeing his expression, Olivia took a few steps back. "Don't worry," he said. "No matter what this world becomes, I'll keep us safe." He drew her into his arms and said with a sly smile, "Your report isn't over yet." After more than an hour of Reporting with Olivia, Charles returned to his residence, where Alice was waiting for him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, leaned in for a kiss, and tugged him over toward the bed, where they spent the night together. When Charles woke up next to a naked Alice the next morning, he felt a pang of regret wash over him. Maybe I am a scumbag like Lena said, he thought. However, he quickly put the thought to the back of his mind. He knew that Olivia and Alice had their own reasons for being with him, and so his conscience was clear. Charles nudged Alice awake, and the two walked to the dining room on shaky legs and sat down at the table with the others. Seeing everyone's malicious stares, Alice's face grew red, and she didn't dare say much. After breakfast, Greg, who'd been guarding the outside of the room, came in and reported to everyone. I've received word that many places have already been rebuilt, and several members of the Cross Church group have gathered in the northern region of Peace City, he said. According to the latest information we've obtained, they seem to be looking for the Holy Maiden. At first, we thought they were trying to play tricks on us, but recently we found out that they seem to be looking for something, and their higher-ups are constantly sending more people up north. The Cross Church group? Not them again, Charles thought with a frown. He hated the church as an establishment. He thought that religious beliefs could be a good thing by providing a source of strength in tough times. But too few people truly practiced what they preached. Most people use the name of the church to amass money, and some even use their power to do unspeakable things. In Charles's past life, the Cross Church group had been a cult that had committed various heinous crimes, casting an even darker shadow on an already dark time. When he had first met Sylvia, who had been a dedicated nun, he had even wanted to kill her because of his hatred of religion. However, the Cross Church group hadn't impacted his previous life much, and it had been quickly destroyed after its crimes had been exposed, with Stellar Technology playing a significant role in its downfall. The conflict between the Cross Church group's teachings and Stellar Technology's ideology had caused the groups to come to blows. The church group had even accused Stellar Technology of being selfish and had said they should share their wealth with everyone. Even Charles had agreed with that sentiment. As a result, the Cross Church group had been quickly destroyed by Stellar Technology. Although there had been a few signs of revival, they had been quickly put out. Miranda scoffed. They're looking for the Holy Maiden? How could they possibly lose track of a goddess? Aren't gods supposed to be everywhere? Dale also snorted in contempt. If the gods they believe in really exist, why don't they destroy these damn zombies? Who knows how many people we've seen praying to the gods along the way, Anthony said angrily. None of them have received any response. They had saved many people under Miranda's lead, and they had dealt with their fair share of those who would rather die than try to survive the apocalypse any longer. But those who disgusted them the most were the people who only knew how to pray to the gods when they were in danger. Those people believed that they had been saved because of the gods' contributions, not the gifts of their saviors on Earth. On the contrary, Miranda and her group didn't believe in the gods, which had angered those who had firm beliefs. Some people had even tried to kill Miranda and the others once they had found out they were non-believers. Charles didn't think much of it. If someone dares to spread the word of God within the borders of Dawn City, I'll send them straight to him, he threatened. Greg's mouth twitched. Before the apocalypse, everyone's right to believe in whatever god they wished, or not to believe in a god at all, had been guaranteed. However, Greg knew in the post-apocalyptic world, complete freedom of religion was potentially problematic. Moreover, he had received orders from the higher-ups in the military. No matter what Charles did, as long as his influence was positive, the military would tolerate his actions. After all, the existence of Dawn City had paved a new and bright path for hundreds of thousands of people, and had set a benchmark for many of the other survival bases, showing them how to survive in the new and chaotic world. With such a significant contribution from Charles in such a short time, the military didn't want to get in his way. There is one more thing, Greg continued. We've been able to contact Washington. Everyone's ears perked up, and even Charles's expression turned serious. He knew many people in Washington. Some of them had died for him, while others had been his lovers or university friends in his previous life. Greg noticed the troubled look on Charles's face, and though he didn't understand it, he made a mental note to investigate later. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She remembered that Charles seemed to know some inside information. When they had been at school, he had accidentally exposed the person who had controlled the nuclear bomb. At the time, she wondered how he knew so much, and the question resurfaced in her mind as Greg spoke about Washington. Some of you may have noticed that a small blast appeared in the north during the first few days of the apocalypse, Greg continued. It was from a nuclear explosion in Washington. It's a military secret why nuclear weapons were used. But although the nukes solved the most urgent problem, they made the situation in Washington even more dangerous. Don't tell me you're asking for help from us, Miranda said with a frown. I don't think Dawn City can support other regions right now, especially a place like Washington, D.C. Although Dawn City had become the leader of a region, who knew what kind of risks they would face in the future? They had more than enough power to protect themselves, but that didn't mean they could quickly dispatch their forces to support others. Moreover, Washington was a considerable distance away. Even if they were to hurry, the dangers along the way would be great. This crisis you're talking about in Washington, said Charles. Do you mean the radiation from the nuclear attack? How did you know? Asked Greg, shocked. Charles shrugged. I've seen this kind of thing in movies, he said. Nobody fully understood how the zombies had originated. Some thought that the virus had started in a laboratory, but this theory had been largely dismissed. After all, it didn't explain why the zombies' arrival had coincided with such a profound upheaval of the laws of physics, when soul energy, too, had entered the world. Some suggested that humans needed to have reached a certain stage of evolution to fully detect and manipulate soul energy. But again, this theory was flawed. For one thing, it begged the question of how a martial artist such as Kevin had been accessing the energy for so long. Although the reason for the zombies' arrival was unclear, this didn't mean that there was no information known about them at all. One thing that seemed certain was that, whether through scientific or supernatural means, a zombie was the outcome of some breakdown in a person's genetic makeup. A person didn't need to be a paranormal to become a zombie. If they lived long enough, the general omnipresence of soul energy in the atmosphere meant that over time, their body would absorb sufficient energy to stimulate their evolution, slowly leading to genetic mutation and potentially turning them into zombies. The lightning cadaver serpent had transformed in this way when the energy it had absorbed during its transformation had been assimilated into its body. Because the energy didn't have anywhere else to go, and because the serpent's body hadn't been equipped to handle such a great change, it had fallen into a state of crisis, which had led to a dramatic change. Nuclear radiation was another catalyst for such change. Since you already guessed it, said Greg, we won't hide it anymore. I'll tell you what I know. A nuclear blast is incredibly powerful, but the effects of the radiation left behind are even greater. So although our attack exterminated our target, the radiation has created many zombies and other mutated beasts. It's made things very difficult in Washington, where the army is strong in number but lacks experts. His meaning was clear. The army didn't need the whole forces of Dawn City to support them, but rather the specific expertise of Charles and his level 5 followers. Theoretically, every opponent could be defeated by sheer numbers alone, but after a certain amount of time, the army would run out of troops. With experts in the field able to share their knowledge of the enemy's weaknesses, they could achieve victory with far fewer losses. Sounds like payback to me, said Zach bitterly. You threw around nuclear weapons without a care for the consequences. Well, these are the consequences. He didn't mean to mock Greg directly. Rather, he was just sick of human nature and how eagerly it created the very things that would end up destroying it. I know you have doubts about the military's decisions, said Greg, but surely you still believe we're doing the right thing. The army in Washington is the strongest in the country. If they hadn't been convinced that nuclear weapons were the only way to defeat the enemy, they wouldn't have used them. Charles understood Greg's point of view. He knew that the difficult decisions the army faced in wartime were no easier for them to make than for regular people. Although he wasn't completely convinced that the military really hadn't had any option other than to go nuclear, his personal experience of Leonard's crimes in the future had shown him that such moments could come to pass much more easily than he felt comfortable with. So, continued Greg, turning to Charles, the army has requested that Dawn City send its top experts to help us deal with the enemy together. The feeling at the table had turned sour. The Dawnians considered Greg's plea as a kind of blackmail that they didn't feel they had any way of refusing. However, they also realized that the army's troops continually sacrificed their lives to defend humanity as best they could, and that if they were asking for help, it had to mean they truly needed it. Therefore, the Daunians were torn between considering their own safety and helping the army to defend the country. They looked to their leader, whose decision, after all, would be final. Although Charles was also deep in thought, his deliberations were of a different sort. He had realized early in Greg's plea that there was no way he could avoid going to Washington. Instead, he was trying to decide on the best way of traveling there. He knew that his means of transport would directly determine the success or failure of the plan. Greg felt particularly downcast as he looked over the less than enthusiastic expressions of Charles and his followers. He hated the idea of bringing harm to others, and so he hadn't found it easy to approach the group with this request. "I know it's a big ask," he said. "If you don't want to go, we won't force you, but we do have another request, which we hope you'll agree to." "What's that?" asked Miranda. "Mayor Federer," said Greg, choosing his words carefully, "we would be very grateful if you could use some of your influence to establish some stability in Montreal. You're a smart man. I don't need to remind you of the importance of maintaining order." Anthony frowned. "Are you going to send us all away from Dawn City?" "Of course not," said Greg. "Some of you will need to stay here, but Montreal is in a state of crisis, and we need all the help we can get." The group was shocked by his request. The Daunians couldn't believe they were being asked to help such an important force as the Montreal army. They realized that things must have deteriorated significantly if Greg had to resort to turning to them. Charles rubbed his forehead. Situations like this reminded him of why he would never join the army. Of course, he respected the soldiers' commitment to placing their beliefs above their own safety. It was thanks to this commitment that the survivors of the apocalypse were able to join forces at all. But this didn't mean he was willing to sacrifice himself. His main goal above all else was to survive. He wasn't interested in becoming any kind of martyr. Putting himself in fraught situations just to satisfy some belief wouldn't help him to save humanity. "I'll go," said Anthony, leaning forward. "I'm at level 5 now. I can protect myself." Dale said, "I'll go too." Calvin quickly followed. "Me too," he said. Zach nodded. "And me," he said. It didn't escape Miranda that the 4 who replied were all her students. She turned to Charles. "Dawn City will still need someone powerful to protect it," she said. "But I think we could help in Montreal, even if you can't join us." She was trying to excuse Charles from leaving the city without him having to refuse outright. If Charles wasn't willing to risk the journey, she could take his place. She had a belief of her own, after all. She believed that Dawn City was the people's brightest beacon of hope, and she would do whatever she needed to ensure Charles could keep his role as the guardian of that hope. "Silence," yelled Charles, slamming the table and looking around at everyone. "Do you think it's fun to go around playing the hero, signing up to get yourselves killed?" "Mayor Federer," said Anthony, "that's not what we meant." He was perplexed by Charles's outburst. Although he was accustomed to their leader acting coldly and ruthlessly, he wasn't used to him shouting at them. "I said silence," shouted Charles, and Anthony hung his head. Then Charles stood up and walked over to Greg. "You said that the reason the military dropped nuclear weapons in Washington was that they had no other choice. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices like that, right?" "That's right," said Greg. "We're facing the extinction of all humanity. We need to do anything we can to tip the scales in our favor, no matter the sacrifice." The paranormals in the room could feel Charles's soul energy brim with anger. "Our goal isn't to sacrifice ourselves at every turn," he said. "It's to get through this crisis in one piece. Since you've decided to take such a large risk, we need to make sure it's worth it." He conjured a spell array in the air, and everyone at the table went pale. "This spell array is part of a contract we formed in Hell. With it, I can summon creatures, but I needed to make a sacrifice to do so. Tell me, how many of you are willing to offer yourselves as sacrifices?" The Daunians stared at Charles, speechless. Although he had used such a spell array in the past, he had always used enemies as sacrifices. But at that moment, he seemed to be seriously suggesting that he was ready to use his own people instead. It chilled them to think that this might be his new battle strategy. Greg wasn't to be intimidated, though. He looked Charles directly in the eye and said, "To stabilize the situation in Washington, we'll sacrifice however many soldiers it takes, and I count myself in that number." He had seen with his own eyes the forces of hell that the right sacrifice could summon. Thinking back on those scenes, he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, however, that offering oneself as a sacrifice and following through with it were two very different things. Zack opened his mouth to speak, but Harper laid a hand on his arm. He turned to her and she shook her head gently, indicating that he should keep quiet. Lena also leaned forward to speak, but Olivia stopped her. Charles's fierce aura suddenly relaxed, and the atmosphere eased up. "If you really do understand the situation," he said, "then let me take command of the reinforcements heading to Washington. Normally I would leave them to you to command, but these are my terms. Once I give you an order, no matter what kind of order it is, you have to obey it." He fixed Greg with his gaze. "Even if I ask you to offer yourself as a sacrifice to the forces of hell, you have to obey." Greg shook his head. "It isn't my decision to make," he said. "Then feed this back to whoever's decision it is," Charles said. "And let me be clear about one thing. I won't let myself or my followers be treated as cannon fodder. If you really want to borrow our power and expertise, then show that you're willing to use it to help us." After a pause, he continued. "I don't care if you agree with me or not," he said. "I'll arrive in Washington within 3 weeks. If you aren't willing to give me command of the reinforcements, I'll just have to take on the enemy by myself. Don't rely on my cooperation. Also, I don't want to leave Dawn City vulnerable in my absence, so I'll be leaving my strongest followers behind." Greg was confused. Does this mean he's going to Washington after all? He wondered. But he just said he'd lead the fight even without the military's assistance, so why is he insisting on command of our reinforcements? Charles was full of contradictions. He had said that he wouldn't interfere with the command of the army, but also that the army had to obey every one of his instructions. Greg didn't dare ask him to clarify. Instead, he stood up and said, "I'll report this to my superior and we'll return with an answer." Then he nodded and left. Once he had left, Charles looked coldly around the table. The others avoided his gaze. They understood that by offering to help in Montreal, they had gotten in the way of their leader's plan. "Do you really think being a hero is just fun and games?" Charles asked them. Calvin was the only one brave enough to speak. "I admit we were a little impulsive just now," he said. "We just wanted to help, so offered our support without properly thinking things through. I know I'm not brave enough to sacrifice myself to save people, but with so many of us offering to join up, I couldn't just stay quiet." When he had offered his help, it had been on impulse, without taking time to consider all the implications of his choice. He had heard that people were in need and had immediately stepped forward to help. Miranda could sense something unusual in Charles's behavior. "Do you know something we don't?" she asked. She had the sense that he had his own plan, which had been disrupted by the military. "Are you worried we'll just become pawns of the military or even cannon fodder?" "The army wouldn't do such a thing," said Anthony. "I got a feeling about that." Charles turned on him. "So you think we should just trust them with our lives because you've got a feeling about it?" Anthony didn't know what to say. He'd been willing to sign himself up to help the army, but hadn't intended to bring everyone else along with him. If his instinct was misguided and had led to the deaths of those around him, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. "I think you've all overlooked something," said Alice. "When the nuclear bomb exploded, there were bound to be civilian casualties. And sure, maybe in the big picture these deaths are unavoidable. But what if when we split up and aren't as strong as we are together, we're treated as necessary sacrifices just as easily as they were?" A chilled silence settled in the room as everyone finally understood the gravity of the choice they had made. Just because the military's goal was to help the people, this didn't mean that they were all powerful and would be able to protect everyone on their side. If the Dawnians signed up to help them, they could well become just a few more names on the list of casualties. Charles smiled at Alice. He knew he could count on her to bring a level-headed attitude to proceedings. "You have to remember we aren't the center of the world," she said. "She's right," said Charles. "All this time we've never really experienced true danger. We've talked about sacrificing ourselves and putting ourselves in harm's way, but we all know we aren't really in the same danger as everyone else. So no matter how strong our principles, when we talk about sacrifice, it doesn't really mean the same as, for instance, when the army does." He looked at Anthony. "People will follow the army to the letter because they trust that they really are protecting them. But remember the great responsibility of such a position. When you decide to sacrifice, you aren't only sacrificing yourself, but everyone who follows you." They all looked down, seeing more clearly than ever that they hadn't properly thought the matter through. In their rush to help, they had made the mistake of forgetting that the sacrifice would affect more people than just them alone. Even Charles had made similar mistakes in his old life, but he had since come to realize that nobody existed in isolation, and a wrong decision could cost not only a person's life, but also the lives of the people around them. To him, this responsibility was more terrifying than death. "They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions," he said, scanning the room, and holding his gaze on Lena for a few moments. "If we get carried away with all our grand principles, we could lead many innocents to their doom. We have to make sure we're thinking clearly, or else we'll make mistakes on the battlefield. And on the battlefield, a single mistake can cost thousands of lives. If you can't think clearly, you have no place at the head of an army." He circled the table and stood next to Miranda, anticipating her reply. "I don't like to fight alongside ordinary soldiers," she said. "If I'm left to my own devices, I can take down many enemies. But if I'm fighting next to other soldiers, how are they ever going to learn to take on powerful enemies by themselves?" "It's difficult to be completely calm in battle," said Charles. "But in many cases, calmness under pressure is more important than wisdom. However, you have to understand one thing. You need that calmness to be able to collect yourself and realize that your decisions no longer decide the life or death of just one person, but of tens of thousands." He arrived next to Olivia. "If we all die, will Dawn City still be able to operate as normal?" he asked. "No," she said. "Dawn City depends on experts like us to defend it. In the past week, the fighting around Montreal led to more than 20,000 casualties. 2 of the survival bases were destroyed completely, while 3 more broke apart into smaller bases." The others were shocked by the news. As residents of Dawn City, they never ran into many problems when searching for resources outside the fortress. They hadn't considered that things would be different in places that didn't have such a powerful group of paranormals to control the risks outside the walls. It didn't matter that the other survival bases had great numbers of troops if they weren't backed up by the experience and strategy of people like Charles and his team. "Do you still think that sacrifice is such a great thing?" Charles looked at them all with his scrutinizing gaze. Only Alice refused to look away. At first, they'd only been thinking about their own strength and survival, but at that moment, they understood that to act so rashly put others at risk. Even if they weren't the highest-ranking members of Dawn City, they were still very much vital to its ongoing survival. They were part of Dawn City's foundation whether they realized it or not. If they were to die, the people under their protection would be left vulnerable. Before they knew it, the great time and effort they had spent in building such a sanctuary would be for nothing. The fate that had befallen the survival bases Olivia had mentioned might be Dawn City's too. "Then why did you agree to go to Washington?" Alice asked. Everyone looked up. It had been clear in the conversation with Greg that Charles would have gone to Washington even without the military. They couldn't understand why he was so keen on going after all he had just said about sacrifice and responsibility. "It's simple," he said. "If you don't advance, you'll retreat." And with that, he left the room. "He wasn't stopping us from taking the risk of going to Montreal," Alice said, watching him leave with admiration in her eyes. "He just wanted to make sure we understood what the consequences would be. He may have his dark moments, but at heart, he's determined to make sure we succeed." The others around the table nodded. They reflected that they didn't know much about Charles's past and had never really questioned how he'd become so ruthless. But at that moment, they felt they understood the great weight on their leader's shoulders. He had his flaws, but he never backed away from responsibility. Maybe they had felt this before, but with his most recent words, they couldn't ignore it. They realized that Alice had been right. They didn't know how much darkness was in Charles's heart, but they could clearly see that he was determined to turn to the light. After their meeting, Charles brought Kevin, Olivia, Lena, and Elena to the old Stellar Technology mine. The veins there were rich with crimson flame energy gems and blue flame energy gems, both extremely important resources to Charles. In a sense, the mine amounted to a large-scale weapons production facility. Because the materials hadn't yet fully developed, he didn't want to extract too much too soon, but there were more than enough gems close to the surface to meet Charles's needs. He wasn't concerned that some other party might take over the mine. He had placed a Dawn City flag there and felt confident that his reputation was such that nobody would try to invade. "Why did you call us here?" asked Lena. "I want to introduce you to one of my pets," said Charles. No sooner had he said it Then the ground cracked open, and Charles's stone man leapt out. The Daunians tensed, wary of attack. "Don't worry," said Charles. "He won't hurt you." He approached the stone man, which had grown to almost 10 feet tall. "It's already reached the highest stage of level 4, he said. "Looks like its skills are well developed. I hadn't expected it to grow into a stone giant so soon." He ordered the stone giant to bend down, and then he placed a hand on its head. The creature roared as Charles channeled a stream of soul energy into it. The giant's body expanded until its head was out of Charles's reach. Before the group's eyes, it grew 30 feet tall, towering over them. Charles's followers stepped back, startled. In the new era, they'd all seen many strange monsters, so a huge stone man leaping from the earth hadn't been too startling. But they were stunned to watch it grow so tall in a matter of minutes. Looking up at such a powerful being, Kevin realized something. He must have had this thing all along, he thought. Olivia had come to the same conclusion. This is his backup plan, she thought. "He's particularly good at defense," said Charles. "I've also built a small survival base underground near here. It'll keep 2,000 people safe for a week. If you run into problems while I'm gone, bring everyone here, and I'll come back as quick as I can. Remember, I have the Nightmare Horse now, so I'll be able to get here in no time. With the stone giant here, though, you'll be well protected even without me." "Am I staying behind?" asked Elena. Charles had arranged that Lena, Olivia, and Kevin would stay in Dawn City, while he took the rest of his core group to Washington. Elena was conflicted. She wanted to stay behind, but also wanted to fight by Charles's side and develop her strength. "Yes," said Charles. "You'll stay behind. It'll be too dangerous in Washington, and you have too many important things to do here now." Elena nodded, trusting that Charles had a good reason for the arrangement. "Do you think we're in danger of attack here?" asked Olivia, surprised by how many defenses Charles had put in place. "We're always in danger of attack," he said. "I can't say exactly what'll happen, but we need to plan for the worst." He knew that no great disasters would befall Montreal in the next year, and that even if anything bad did happen, the military would be able to deal with it. However, his rebirth had changed a lot of things, and he knew that their actions in the present day might have unforeseen consequences in the future, contradicting his knowledge of what should happen. He had to be cautious. If he became complacent, relying on his knowledge of his previous life, and not entertaining the possibility that things might turn out differently, it could spell disaster. So since he had decided to go to Washington, he needed to leave behind the correct preparations to ensure the people he was leaving behind would be protected. "I understand," Olivia said indifferently. At Charles's order, the stone giant began to dig for gems. While it was busy, Charles bestowed on Lena the giant's summoning mark, erasing the hellish creature mark that was already there. Thanks to the many crystal cores she had used, Lena had already reached level 5. Under Charles's guidance, she developed a great deal of strength and survival skills. Finally, Charles deemed his arrangements sufficient. He had a great deal of faith in Olivia's abilities. If anything befell them in his absence, it would not be through any lack of preparation on his part. Besides, he had left a mark on the stone giant's body that would allow him to quickly reach the mine by way of hell before rushing to Dawn City. He took some of the gems from the stone giant and packed them into the energy storage space. Then he and his group returned to Dawn City. That night, Greg arrived with the military's decision. "The higher-ups have already decided that Lewis will lead 15,000 troops to assist the army," he said. "Lewis has been made a temporary commander, but he's been told that he has to listen to any of your requests, and unless they go against our own goals, his soldiers will do their best to fulfill them, even if it means offering themselves as sacrifices. This doesn't apply to Lewis himself or his 12 best paranormals, though. They retain the right to retreat if needs be." He paused before adding, "Also, the military will leave troops near Dawn City to protect it in your absence." He spoke robotically, as though he didn't fully agree with the decisions of his superiors. As far as he was concerned, the army was bending over backwards to help Charles. Charles smiled bitterly. "Lewis and his paranormals can duck out whenever they need to, huh?" he said. "You guys must have learnt a few lessons from the beating you took in Butte." He saw the wisdom in this strategy, though. Although on paper it was a good thing for the strong to stay behind to protect the weak, if the strong were killed, the weak would die anyway. Charles knew this from the time that the Hive Queen had broken through their defenses when they had been defending the fortress. It showed that the military were trying a new tactic. They must have truly learned from their bloody lesson in Butte. So, do you agree? Greg asked. Why not? Said Charles. I've already said I'll take my people to Washington even without your help, so consider my terms your payment for my support. He had never really intended to use the army as sacrifices to hell, but by making such an extreme demand, he had known that the army would counter with something still very agreeable. He had known that Richard, the Montreal Military Region's commander, was smart enough to read between the lines. He must have known that Charles would never have sacrificed so many people. By stating that they agreed to this demand, though, they would have been putting across the wrong signal. He had needed a way to keep Charles happy while also sending the right message to the soldiers. With their terms, the military had shown that they had a good understanding of the situation and that they were willing to cooperate at Charles's level. Charles admired this and wanted to return the favor. On the third day after the military had announced its decision, the people of Dawn City were ready to leave for Washington. After some negotiations, it was finally agreed that 345 of Charles's followers would go. He gave Mark command of the Knights of Hell, 121 of which would accompany them while the others would stay behind with Olivia. Although Mark wasn't quite as strong as the Paranormals, he'd been among the first martial artists that Charles had trained as a knight. Besides, all the knights were martial artists, so it made sense to have such an experienced one at their head. Charles was adamant about keeping the knights as regular martial artists rather than training them as paranormals. He knew such fighters had a unique function on the battlefield separate from that of paranormals. In addition to the knights, Charles would bring 32 paranormals and 85 regular warriors. These were all people who had family or friends in Washington who they wanted to make sure were safe. Charles sympathized with them. In his previous life, as soon as he had built up his strength, he had searched everywhere for his sister, so he understood the desperation of seeking lost family members. However, he reminded them that their search was theirs alone, and that he wouldn't be able to guarantee their safety along the way. Still, he was confident that under Olivia's training, they had learned to fend for themselves. As long as they weren't reckless, he didn't foresee them running into any problems. Miranda's core team was only made up of 26 people. However, they were strong enough that they had already saved close to 1,000. In addition to these 26, she would be taking 25 others as part of her cohort to Washington. Charles didn't mind that his group was made up of some inexperienced members. In fact, his main reason for making the journey to Washington was to train them. When they arrived, he planned to lead them with the military so that they could improve their combat skills, leaving him free to focus on his own plans. Before leaving, he reminded Mark, "I'm giving you command of the Knights, but if you're going to survive out there, you need to listen to Tina and the others. They've followed me longer than anyone. I trust their judgment completely." Mark nodded. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll make sure to follow their advice and treat them with the greatest respect." Although he was in command of the Knights, he knew when to defer to those with more experience. Charles took out dozens of tokens and handed them to Zach. "I have business to attend to with Miranda," he said. "You can use these tokens to communicate with me. Although they aren't as flexible as using a radio, the signal is more stable. If anything happens, let me know, and I'll get to you in a few days." Zach was puzzled. "Aren't we leaving together?" he asked. Charles shook his head. "The more of us there are, the slower we'll go. Don't worry. Follow the route I've given you, and I'll never be too far away." After making their arrangements, the knights climbed onto their two-horned horses and set off. Alice, Zach, and some others in Charles's inner circle brought up the rear, while the regular followers rode in cars and off-road vehicles in the middle. It was their responsibility to protect their supplies and logistical equipment. Meanwhile, Charles and Miranda left the team on the fastest nightmare horses, charging off at lightning speed. On the 7th floor of the watchtower, Jenny tugged on Sylvia's sleeve. "Sylvia," she said, "when can we tell everyone that I've woken up? I don't want Mom to worry about me." Sylvia stroked Jenny's hair. "Don't worry," she said. "Don't you want to protect your mom? I promise that as soon as you've learned the proper techniques, we'll go find her." Jenny nodded with determination. "That's right," she said. "I'm going to protect Mom. I'm almost there. I can feel it. I'll be ready to find her soon."